So a huge shakeup could be on the horizon for India's corporate world. The government's put a new set of rules on the table, and they could fundamentally change how businesses operate. In this explainer, we're going to dive into the Corporate Laws Amendment Bill of 2026 and figure out, what's really changing and why it should matter to all of us.
And really, this whole debate boils down to one central question. What if running a business got a whole lot simpler, but also a whole lot riskier? That's the real tension here, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so the official name for this proposal is the Corporate Laws Amendment Bill 2026. And what it's really aiming to do is update two pretty foundational laws, the Companies Act from 2013 and the Limited Liability Partnership Act from 2008.
Now, I want to be clear, this is not just some minor tweak. After the finance minister introduced it, the bill was immediately handed over to a special 31-member Joint Parliamentary Committee. And that right there tells you just how big these changes are. Parliament is saying, whoa, let's hit pause and do a really deep, thorough analysis on this one. They're expected to have a report ready by the monsoon session.
All right, so what's the big idea behind this new playbook? What's the government really trying to accomplish here? Let's take a look at the official goals.
Okay, so they've laid out 4 main goals. First off, they want to simplify compliance, basically cut down on all that red tape. Second, and this is a huge one we'll talk more about, is to decriminalize minor mistakes. Third, the idea is to modernize India's whole corporate framework so it's more in line with global standards. And finally, they actually want to strengthen governance by giving more power to regulatory bodies. The whole thing is really about making India a more appealing place to set up shop.
All right, so that's the big picture. But now let's get into the nitty-gritty, the fine print, and see what this bill actually changes for businesses on the ground.
Yeah, the real headline grabber, the thing everyone's talking about, is this idea of decriminalizing minor corporate offenses. This is a very deliberate move, and it's all about improving the mood in the business community, taking away that fear of facing serious penalties for small slip-ups.
And the change is pretty significant. Let me put it this way. The old system was kind of like getting detention if you were late to class. The new proposed system, it's more like getting a small fine. So for companies, this means shifting away from the threat of actual criminal charges for small mistakes and moving towards simple financial penalties. The hope is this will ease the burden on the courts and just get things resolved much, much faster.
Okay, the next big area the bill tackles is corporate social responsibility, or CSR. Those rules that say profitable companies have to spend some of their money on social projects.
And the big number to remember here is 10 crore rupees. The bill wants to double the profit level where these CSR rules even start to apply. It's currently at 5 crore, so this would bump it up. And what that means, plain and simple, is that fewer companies will be required to spend on CSR.
And there are some other loosened rules in here too. Some small companies might get a complete pass, and the deadline to move unspent CSR money is being stretched from 30 days all the way to 90. But, and this is really important, for the big companies that still qualify, the main rule isn't changing. They still have to spend that 2% of their average net profits on social causes. The bill's also packed with a bunch of other modern updates. For instance, it would allow hybrid shareholder meetings using video conferencing, which is a huge nod to our post-pandemic reality, right? It also makes the rules around share buybacks a bit easier. That's when a company buys its own stock back to give itself more financial breathing room. And finally, it creates a whole new process for certain trusts to change into limited liability partnerships. But of course, not everyone is cheering for these changes. And this is where we get to the great debate. Is this bill genuine progress, or is it accidentally creating a whole new can of worms? So let's start with the core of the opposition's argument. It's really summed up well in this quote from MP Manish Tiwari. He says, the bill reduces Parliament to enacting a skeletal framework. What he means is that it's basically handing over way too much power to government agencies.
And look, this isn't just a political soundbite. It's an actual legal concept called skeletal legislation. Basically, it's when Parliament draws up a really broad outline for a law, but then delegates all the power to fill in the crucial details to executive bodies. The big concern here is accountability. And it's not a new worry either. The Supreme Court actually warned against this exact thing way back in a 1960 case.
The other huge point of contention, you guessed it, CSR. MP Saugata Roy doesn't mince words here. He argues that the bill seeks to dilute that provision altogether. The fear from critics is that by raising that profit threshold, one of India's key social welfare policies is being seriously watered down. And this really gets to the heart of the trade-off, doesn't it?
On one hand, you have the goal of creating a business-friendly climate with less red tape. But on the other hand, you have these very real concerns about losing parliamentary oversight, weakening CSR, and opening the door for these looser rules to be misused.
So all of this leads us to the fundamental challenge of this bill: finding that perfect balance and really understanding what is at stake for India's economy.
When you strip everything else away, the whole debate really comes down to this one challenge. How do you free up the economy and make it easier to do business without losing the essential guardrails of accountability and good governance? That's the tightrope they have to walk.
Look, there is no doubt this bill is a huge, intentional push to modernize India's corporate world. The whole point is to bring the country in line with global best practices and, ultimately, make it a more competitive and attractive place for investment.
And that leaves us with the final, critical question. Will this new playbook actually fuel sustainable growth? Or will this big push for simplicity end up weakening the very guardrails that keep the economy safe? That is the multi-billion-dollar question that the Parliamentary Committee, and really the entire country, is going to have to answer.